The courtroom froze. Not a whisper, not a cough, not even the shuffle of papers broke the silence. Jasmine Crockett's words lingered in the air like a thunderclap that had shaken the very walls. Faces in the gallery stiffened, jaws slackened, eyes wide in disbelief. Even the marble columns seemed to lean forward, as if straining to catch every echo of her voice. For one heartbeat, time itself appeared suspended. At the center of it all sat Judge Richard Leon. Known for his iron presence, his courtroom was usually a place where confidence dissolved and bravado was cut down to size. He was the kind of judge whose very glance could silence a lawyer mid-sentence. For decades, attorneys had trembled under his questions, their arguments collapsing under his stare. That day, he had expected another routine display of control. But this was no ordinary moment, and Jasmine Crockett was no ordinary presence. She stood firm, eyes locked on the bench, her voice still vibrating in the minds of those who heard it. The judge's gavel rested quietly at his side, forgotten, as if even he knew that striking it now would only expose how much authority had already slipped from his hands. No one in the courtroom expected what happened next, whispered one spectator afterward, recalling the way the air seemed to tighten, the way every breath caught as Crockett spoke. It wasn't just her words, it was the calm, unshaken conviction behind them. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't flinching. She was commanding the room, and for the first time in his long career, Judge Richard Leon seemed the one left searching for ground. The audience glanced between the two figures, the judge, stern and monumental, the very image of the law's power, and Crockett, unyielding, radiating a dignity that refused to bend. It was more than a clash of arguments. It felt like something larger, a collision between old authority and rising truth, between arrogance and the quiet steel of resilience. Every person in that courtroom knew they were witnessing something unforgettable. Yet what none of them realized was that this moment, this breathless silence, was only the crest of the wave. But the real story begins before this moment, when the tension quietly started to build. Long before Jasmine Crockett's words froze the courtroom, the atmosphere inside those four walls was already electric. Everyone present knew this was not just another case, it was a crucible. Careers, reputations, and even the public's trust in the system seemed to hang in the balance. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed and microphones crowded the steps. Reporters spoke in hurried tones, eager to capture every ripple of what promised to be a defining showdown. Inside, the gallery packed with spectators waited with the nervous energy of an audience about to witness history. At the center of it all stood Judge Richard Leon, a man whose name alone carried weight in Washington legal circles. He was legendary for his sharp tongue, his impatience with weakness, his unflinching command of the room. Lawyers whispered that appearing before him was like stepping into a storm. One wrong move, and you'd be struck down, your credibility shredded beyond repair. He relished control, and his authority was rarely challenged, until that day. And then there was Jasmine Crockett. She entered with no fanfare, no theatrics. Yet her presence carried its own gravity. She walked with a calm that contrasted the storm she was about to enter. Some in the gallery underestimated her, expecting another attorney to be swallowed by Leon's dominance. But those who watched closely saw it, the steadiness in her eyes, the quiet assurance in her posture. She had come not to bow, but to stand. The stakes could not have been higher. This wasn't only about the immediate case, it was about credibility, about whose version of truth would take root in the minds of the public. For Leon, it was another opportunity to reaffirm his iron grip, to remind all who entered his courtroom that power belonged to him alone. For Crockett, it was a chance to show that dignity and clarity could cut through even the most intimidating wall of authority. The tension mounted with each exchange. Leon's questions were sharp, his tone deliberate, as if daring Crockett to stumble. His reputation loomed like a shadow over her every word. The gallery leaned forward, waiting for the crack in her armor, the moment she would falter under his gaze. But Jasmine Crockett did not falter. She absorbed each question, each interruption, with the patience of someone who had weathered storms before. Her responses were measured, precise and calm, as though she were peeling away at the judge's certainty layer by layer. The battle lines were clear: arrogance on one side, resilience on the other. What made the moment so gripping was not just the clash of personalities, but the sense that the entire courtroom had become a symbolic battlefield. It was no longer merely about facts and procedure. It was about something deeper. Could truth stand tall in the face of towering authority? Could a lone voice shift the balance of power in a space designed to intimidate? Whispers rippled through the gallery as the tension thickened. Every pause in Crockett's answers seemed deliberate, every measured word carrying more weight than expected. The judge pressed harder, raising the stakes with each attempt to rattle her. And the more he pressed, the more composed she became. The audience, once certain of Leon's dominance, began to sense a subtle shift. They couldn't name it yet, but they felt it. The ground beneath the judge's feet was beginning to move. And just when it seemed she might be cornered, Jasmine Crockett revealed a side no one saw coming. To understand the weight of that courtroom battle, you first have to understand the man who presided over it, Judge Richard Leon. For decades, his name had echoed through Washington's legal halls like a thunderclap. To some, he was the embodiment of judicial strength, a figure who upheld the law with an iron fist and refused to yield to pressure. To others, he was the storm itself, unpredictable, domineering, a man whose sharp words could strip a seasoned attorney of confidence in mere seconds. Leon had built his career on a reputation for toughness. He was not the kind of judge who smiled politely from the bench or indulged drawn-out speeches. His courtroom was a place of order, precision, and above all, dominance. Lawyers knew that stepping into his chambers meant preparing for a test of will as much as a test of law. Some compared it to a trial by fire, where the judge himself became the fiercest opponent you would ever face. There was no denying his brilliance. His rulings were often cited, his decisions dissected in law schools, his legal mind praised even by those who feared him. He carried himself with the certainty of someone who had not only mastered the rules of the game, but also knew how to bend the players to his will. His voice, deep and commanding, could silence a crowded room without the strike of a gavel. His glare, sharp and unyielding, could unravel the confidence of even the most prepared attorneys. But beneath the respect he commanded lay another layer: fear. Stories circulated in hushed tones among young lawyers about the times Leon cut someone down mid-sentence, dismissing their arguments as if they were the fumblings of amateurs. He was known for impatience, for the curt interruptions that reminded everyone who truly ran the room. While many admired his strength, others quietly questioned whether that strength often crossed into arrogance. Was his authority always about justice, or sometimes about power itself? That contradiction defined Richard Leon. Celebrated in the press for his hardline approach, he was equally whispered about in private for his dismissive edge. Some saw him as a guardian of the law, unwilling to let sentiment cloud judgment. Others saw him as a gatekeeper of intimidation, ruling not only with intellect but with sheer force of presence. On that day, as he sat above the courtroom, these contradictions all seemed to converge. To the audience, Leon was almost mythic, the stern judge who had cowed countless lawyers before. The murmurs in the gallery carried both admiration and unease. People leaned to one another, predicting that Crockett, like so many before her, would be reduced to stammers under his questions. His reputation had already done half the work. Fear filled the room long before his gavel came down. Every detail of his presence reinforced that aura. His posture was upright, unyielding, as if carved from the very marble that framed the courtroom. His words came slowly, each one dipped in authority, each one designed to remind everyone who commanded the space. He did not shout, he didn't need to. His restraint was more powerful than volume, his pauses heavy enough to make silence feel like judgment. For the spectators, it was difficult not to feel intimidated. Here was a man who had spent his life towering over others in this chamber of law, who seemed to embody the very weight of the institution itself. He was not simply a judge, he was the system personified. The hierarchy, the authority, the centuries of precedent that loomed over every individual who dared to stand at the podium. And so, before Jasmine Crockett even spoke, the battle already felt uneven. She was one attorney facing a titan, a woman of dignity stepping into a space where countless others had been crushed by his impatience. To many in the audience, it seemed inevitable that Leon's dominance would once again prevail. They could already imagine the headlines: the unshakable judge maintaining his grip, the challenger dismissed and diminished. Yet what those spectators did not fully grasp was that authority, when mixed with pride, creates cracks invisible to the one holding it. Leon's confidence was unshakable, but perhaps too unshakable. A man so sure of his control that he had no reason to expect anyone could unsettle it. His dominance was legendary, yes, but it had also become routine, and routine can blind even the strongest to the possibility of change. The gallery saw a judge at the height of his power, a figure of intimidation whose reputation alone seemed enough to dictate the outcome. But what they did not yet see was that they were about to witness the first true challenge to that dominance. Not from anger or force, but from calm, unflinching clarity. To understand why Jasmine Crockett stood so unshaken before Judge Richard Leon, you have to step back from the grandeur of the courtroom and return to the beginning of her journey. A story written not in marble halls, but in small homes, crowded classrooms, and communities that had learned resilience the hard way. Jasmine's life had never been one of ease. Her family carried the scars and the pride of immigrant roots. Her grandparents had arrived in America with little more than determination, working long hours in jobs that rarely offered comfort, but always demanded endurance. They passed down not just stories of hardship, but lessons in dignity, that standing tall in the face of injustice was not optional, it was survival. From an early age, Jasmine absorbed these lessons. She was the child who asked why rules seemed to apply differently to different people, why voices from her neighborhood were dismissed while others were amplified. Teachers noticed her sharp mind, the way she questioned not just the what, but the why. It wasn't arrogance, it was a hunger to understand the structures around her. And one day, to challenge them. She excelled academically, not because the path was smooth, but because she refused to yield to its obstacles. Nights of studying after part-time jobs, mornings that began before dawn, weekends devoted not to leisure but to service in her community. All of it forged her character. When she chose law, it wasn't out of abstract ambition. It was personal. She had seen too many lives bent by systems that ignored their humanity, too many stories silenced before they could even be heard. Her early legal career reflected that commitment. While others chased prestige, Jasmine sought purpose. She represented clients who couldn't afford the kind of polished defense that wealth buys. She walked into courtrooms where everything seemed stacked against her. The judge's impatience, the jury's bias, the weight of assumptions pressing against every word she spoke. And yet, in those moments she never lost her calm. She had faced storms before, and each one taught her how to stay calm when the thunder roared. Beyond the courtroom, her work in the community built her reputation not as a distant figure of authority, but as a neighbor, an advocate, a listener. She spent hours in community centers, tutoring students, advising families, helping young people understand not just the law, but their own worth within it. She was the lawyer who didn't just speak for people, she stood with them. That kind of authenticity could not be faked, and it set her apart. Yet with every step forward came sacrifice. Jasmine often walked into rooms where she was underestimated. As a woman, as a black attorney, as someone who spoke with passion rather than polished detachment, she was often met with skepticism. Some dismissed her as too bold, others as too emotional. But where others saw obstacles, she saw proof that her fight mattered. Each attempt to belittle her only sharpened her resolve. The irony was that those very traits critics tried to use against her, her empathy, her refusal to bow, her connection to ordinary people, became her greatest strengths. They gave her arguments a moral gravity, a resonance that facts alone could not carry. She wasn't just reciting law, she was embodying its purpose. Her rise did not come through shortcuts. It was carved through nights of doubt, mornings of determination, and a relentless faith that dignity, no matter how battered, was stronger than arrogance. Those who knew her best understood that Jasmine Crockett carried within her a balance that few could master: intellect sharpened by struggle, compassion fortified by hardship, and a calm born from knowing she had nothing left to fear. And so, when she walked into Judge Leon's courtroom that day, she carried not only her legal briefs, but the weight of every battle she had fought before. The room may have belonged to the judge in title, but Jasmine brought with her an authority that came not from power, but from perseverance. The audience could not yet see it, but her story had prepared her for this confrontation more than any reputation ever could. Her presence was not loud, not showy. It was steady, unyielding. She stood in that courtroom as the moral center of the unfolding drama, not because she claimed it, but because she lived it. Every word she spoke was backed by years of sacrifice, every pause filled with the echoes of voices she carried with her family, her community, her clients who had taught her that justice is not a theory, but a lifeline. She had faced storms before, and each one taught her how to stay calm when the thunder roared. That preparation would soon be tested under the most intense spotlight yet. The silence that had blanketed the courtroom shattered as Judge Richard Leon leaned forward, his voice cutting through the air with the weight of authority. "Counselor," he said, his tone deliberate, almost biting. "Are you suggesting that your interpretation carries more weight than decades of precedent?" The words dripped with dismissal, the kind of question designed less to inquire than to corner. Heads in the gallery turned toward Jasmine, many expecting her to falter beneath the force of his challenge. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She raised her eyes to meet his, her expression calm, her voice steady. "No, Your Honor," she replied, each word measured. "I am suggesting that the precedent itself demands we consider the dignity and rights at stake here. That is not an interpretation. That is the very essence of justice." The audience stirred. Leon's eyebrow arched, his lips pressing into a thin line. He was accustomed to lawyers retreating under his scrutiny, softening their words, stumbling over apologies. But here was Crockett, firm yet respectful, refusing to be diminished. He tried again, sharper this time. "You're arguing from principle, not from law. This is a courtroom, not a lecture hall." The jab was clear, but Jasmine absorbed it with grace. "Respectfully, Your Honor, the law without principle is merely power, and power without restraint has never been the foundation of American justice." Her words landed softly but with undeniable force. The gallery leaned in, Sensing the rising heat, Leon shifted in his chair. His questions became more rapid, his interruptions more frequent, as though he could press her into misstep through sheer persistence. He dissected technicalities, demanded citations, and layered his voice with condescension. Yet each time Jasmine answered not with defensiveness, but with clarity. She spoke as though she had rehearsed for this exact storm, though in truth, it was the storms of her life that had rehearsed her. The courtroom's energy began to shift. What had started as a display of Leon's dominance now looked more like a contest of endurance. And in that contest, it was the judge who seemed restless, his tone edged with frustration. While Crockett's calm presence anchored the room, spectators exchanged glances. Some whispered in disbelief. They had come expecting another attorney swallowed whole by Leon's authority, but instead, they were witnessing a duel unlike anything they had seen before. Each exchange felt like a blow and counterblow, but one side was beginning to show cracks. Leon's questions, once so commanding, now carried a trace of agitation. His voice rose slightly, his interruptions grew longer. Meanwhile, Crockett's answers only grew sharper, her pauses deliberate, her confidence unshaken. It was as if the harder he pushed, the stronger she became. The tension was palpable. Every word between them was a spark, every pause a held breath. The courtroom had transformed into an arena, with the audience caught in the suspense of each unfolding moment. Authority and resilience clashed openly, and for the first time, some began to wonder if the unshakable judge might be the one on the defensive. Then came the turning point, a response so sharp it left the room frozen in silence. The clash had reached a boiling point. Judge Richard Leon's questions had grown sharper, his tone clipped, his interruptions more frequent. It was the familiar rhythm of his courtroom dominance overwhelm, belittle and reassert control. Dozens of lawyers before Jasmine Crockett had stumbled here, tripping over his verbal traps, crumbling under the sheer weight of his presence. But Jasmine was different. She let his last question hang in the air, a question meant to box her in, to corner her into retreat. She didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she paused. The pause stretched long enough for the audience to shift in their seats, for Leon himself to frown slightly, as though unnerved by her refusal to play by his tempo. Then she spoke. "Your Honor," Jasmine began, her voice steady, measured, and calm. "You've asked whether principle outweighs precedent. I ask you, what is the purpose of precedent if not to protect principle? Precedent was never meant to be a cage. It was meant to be a guide, a reminder that law is not static but alive. And if we choose to treat it as immovable, then we risk turning justice into ritual and fairness into formality." The words cut through the room like a blade wrapped in velvet. The gallery erupted in murmurs, quickly hushed by the bailiff's glare, but the whispers lingered. Leon leaned back, adjusting his glasses, perhaps to mask the slight shift in his composure. Jasmine did not stop. She let the tension build, then pressed forward, each phrase striking with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she wanted to leave behind. "You've built your reputation, Judge, on defending the authority of this courtroom. And authority has its place. But authority without accountability is not justice. It is power, and power that silences instead of serves is not what this country was built upon." The audience's eyes darted between the bench and the podium, watching Leon's once imposing presence flicker under the weight of her words. A man who had cowed lawyers for decades was now, for the first time, being forced to listen, truly listen, to a voice that refused to bend. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering but gaining intensity. "We sit here today not to preserve the pride of tradition, but to ensure the dignity of people. And dignity is not negotiable. It is not granted by the bench. It is not erased by precedent. It is inherent. That is why we are here." Her words rang with such clarity that the silence that followed seemed louder than any gabble. People in the gallery sat frozen, their breaths caught midair. Even the court stenographer, hands flying across the keys, stole a glance up from her machine, as if aware that this transcript would be more than a record. It would be history. Leon shifted again, his jaw tightening. He tried to interject, but Jasmine pressed forward, not with defiance, but with the calm insistence of truth. "You asked me to separate law from principle, as if one can exist without the other. But the truth is, Your Honor, when law abandons principle, it ceases to be law at all. It becomes tyranny dressed in procedure." That line landed like a thunderbolt. A gasp swept across the room, and for the first time, Judge Leon's gaze faltered. His lips parted, as though ready to respond, but no words came. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Jasmine stood there unshaken, her eyes steady on the bench. She was not grandstanding. She was not raising her voice. Yet the dignity in her tone carried more force than any shout could. It was the kind of clarity that needed no amplification, because it carried the weight of truth. The audience felt it in their bones. A young law student in the gallery leaned forward, whispering to his classmate, This is the moment. This is history. A seasoned attorney, one who had long respected Leon's dominance, shook his head slowly in awe. "She's doing what no one's ever done," he muttered under his breath. Even the bailiff, trained to remain stoic, seemed to stiffen as though acknowledging the gravity of what had just unfolded. Leon's face betrayed subtle cracks. He adjusted his robes, cleared his throat, his once unchallenged authority now shaken. He had always been the one to deliver the cutting line, the devastating put down that froze the courtroom. But today, it was Jasmine Crockett who had delivered the mic drop, a dismantling of arrogance with nothing but clarity, dignity, and fact. The silence that followed was not the silence of intimidation. It was the silence of realization. Every person in that chamber knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. And yet, the ripple was only beginning. One by one, people began to exchange glances that said more than words. They had seen Leon humbled, his authority pierced by truth. They had seen a woman who carried with her the weight of every struggle she had ever endured, stand unmovable against one of the most intimidating judges in America. The whispers started small. "Did you hear what she said? That line. It's going to be everywhere. She just changed the game." Even as the courtroom tried to regain its rhythm, the electricity in the air refused to dissipate. Those present would leave with stories to tell, tweets to draft, calls to make. Clips of her words, once transcribed, would ignite debates, inspire headlines, and ripple across social media like wildfire. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett had not just defended her case. She had defended the very idea that law must serve people, not the other way around. And by doing so, she had struck a chord deeper than any ruling or verdict could reach. The judge shifted again, visibly unsettled, his grip on authority shaken in front of an audience that would never forget what they had seen. But outside the courtroom, the shockwaves were only just beginning. The courtroom emptied slowly that day, but the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's words refused to die. By the time the last file was stacked and the gallery cleared, the real storm had already begun. Online, within minutes, someone who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom posted a short clip of the exchange. The video, only 40 seconds long, captured the exact moment Jasmine delivered her mic drop line. When law abandons principle, it ceases to be law at all. It becomes tyranny dressed in procedure. That single clip detonated across social media like a spark in dry grass. On Twitter, or what many now called simply, hashtags began trending within the hour. Crockett vs. Land dignit overpower far tyranny procedure. The last one alone drew thousands of retweets as users quoted Jasmine's words over and over again. A college student in Boston type, "This line belongs in history books. Crockett just schooled a federal judge with more grace than I've ever seen." Another wrote, "You can feel the silence in that room. That's what truth sounds like." By nightfall, the clip had racked up millions of views. TikTok creators set it to dramatic background music, editing in slow-motion shots of Leon adjusting his glasses and then freezing the moment Jasmine's words landed. Memes flooded Instagram, some playful, others reverent. One viral post showed Leon's stern face next to the caption, "Boss fight defeated. Next level unlock Jasmine Crockett." But it wasn't just internet humor. Commentators and public figures weighed in, recognizing the deeper significance. A well-known civil rights activist tweeted, "What Crockett did today wasn't just a defense in a courtroom. It was a defense of principle. Judges hold power, but people hold truth." Cable news picked it up within hours. On one network, a legal analyst shook his head in awe. "I've covered Judge Leon for decades. No one stands toe to toe with him like that. No one." Crockett didn't just argue, she elevated the entire debate. Another channel ran a segment titled, "The Day the Courtroom Stood Still." Celebrities chimed in too, amplifying the moment to audiences far outside the world of politics and law. An Oscar-winning actress shared the clip with the caption, "This is why representation matters." Jasmine Crockett, remember her name. A Grammy-winning musician added, "Dignity is louder than arrogance." She proved it. Even politicians who rarely agreed found themselves aligned in admiration. One senator tweeted, "We need more leaders who can speak truth with dignity." What Jasmine Crockett did in that courtroom is what democracy looks like. And in living rooms across America, ordinary viewers sat transfixed as the replayed footage aired on nightly news. Parents paused dinner to show their kids. Teachers forwarded the link to their students. Pastors quoted her line from the pulpit the following Sunday. What happened in Judge Leon's courtroom had leapt far beyond the four walls of federal proceedings. It had entered the bloodstream of culture itself. Yet the real story wasn't just about virality, it was about validation. America, watching in real time, seemed to collectively recognize that they had witnessed something bigger than a mere legal argument. They had seen a reminder that truth could still shake power, that dignity could still silence arrogance. In coffee shops and offices, people replayed the clip not for entertainment but for reassurance. She stood her ground. One man told his coworker, "That's what it means to fight without losing your composure." Communities that had long felt unheard saw in Jasmine a reflection of their own struggles. Activists used her words as rallying cries. Students cited her in debate clubs. Churches quoted her in bulletins. It wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. And Judge Richard Leon, he became a symbol too, though not the kind he had built his career upon. Overnight he was cast as the man outmatched, the imposing figure who finally met his equal, and lost. Editorial cartoons painted him slumped on the bench, while Crockett stood firm, radiant with truth. The irony was almost poetic. For years, Leon's reputation had been one of dominance, the unmovable authority. Now his legacy might forever include the moment Jasmine Crockett's words froze him in silence. But while the world rushed to celebrate the viral sensation, while hashtags surged and headlines stacked, a quieter truth lingered beneath the noise. Because Jasmine's victory was never about humiliation. It was never about winning the internet. It was about something deeper, something she had carried with her long before this case even began. And that deeper moral, the one hidden behind the applause and the trending hashtags, was about to come into focus. When the noise of social media, the breaking headlines, and the swelling applause settled into something quieter, Jasmine Crockett herself offered the perspective that mattered most. For her, the confrontation with Judge Richard Leon was never a duel of egos. It wasn't about her winning against him. It was about something older, deeper, and more enduring: truth against arrogance, principle against pride. In interviews that followed, Jasmine made this clear. "I didn't stand up to a judge," she explained with calm certainty. "I stood up for the idea that justice doesn't bow to intimidation. No matter who sits on the bench, truth has its own authority." And in those words, the moral of the story crystallized. What America had witnessed wasn't just a courtroom clash. It was a masterclass in composure. Crockett showed that dignity, when carried with conviction, could outlast the sharpest rebuke and disarm the most powerful glare. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match arrogance with arrogance. She simply held steady, and in that steadiness she became unshakable. The lesson stretched far beyond law. It reached into classrooms where students face bullies, into workplaces where silence often protects the loudest voices, into neighborhoods where families feel unseen by the institutions towering over them. Crockett's moment became their mirror, the assurance that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers with such clarity that the world has no choice but to stop and listen. Judge Leon, for all his reputation and authority, symbolized the old belief that intimidation could hold the floor. But Jasmine Crockett turned that belief on its head. Her calm presence said what many longed to hear, that arrogance is brittle, and when pressed by dignity, it cracks. And perhaps that is why her words rang so widely. They weren't just her victory. They belonged to everyone who has ever walked into a room feeling small, who has ever faced someone who tried to silence them, who has ever wondered if their truth could matter against towering power. Crockett proved it could. She became, in that moment, not just a lawyer defending a case, but a living emblem of resilience. A reminder that identity, history, and the quiet strength of community can stand shoulder to shoulder with the loudest authority and still emerge whole. America, fractured though it often feels, found a rare thread of unity in her example, because what she embodied was not partisan. It was profoundly human. The belief that justice is not the property of the powerful, but the birthright of the people. The crescendo of her story carried a simple but powerful truth. Dignity is not weakness. Dignity is defiance sharpened by clarity and wrapped in self-respect. It doesn't crumble under pressure, it grows. And in that lesson lay the heart of Americanness itself. The idea that the measure of a nation is not in its wealth or its weapons, but in its ability to protect truth, to honor dignity, to stand firm when arrogance tries to eclipse principle. For countless viewers, Crockett became more than a headline. She became a guidepost. A reassurance that moral clarity still matters, that even when institutions feel too large to challenge, one person's composure can reset the balance. Her confrontation with Leon would be remembered, yes. But more importantly, her refusal to turn the moment into a personal victory would define her legacy. She showed that true power is never about humiliating another. It's about lifting the standard of truth so high that even pride cannot cast a shadow on it. And so, the story settled not as a clash of personalities, but as a parable of resilience. A lesson for anyone listening that justice does not wear the face of intimidation. It wears the calm, steady gaze of those who refuse to waver. Judge Richard Leon amazed by Jasmine Crockett's courtroom defense. That was the moment that froze the room, the moment that showed arrogance can crumble while dignity stands tall. What began as a clash of authority and composure ended as a lesson for everyone watching. Intimidation is temporary, but truth lasts. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an exchange. She reminded America that justice doesn't need to shout to be heard. She showed that real strength isn't measured by volume or position, but by the courage to stay calm when power tries to silence you. That's why her words now echo beyond the walls of that courtroom, carried by millions who saw in her a reflection of resilience, clarity, and moral conviction. And the takeaway is simple: arrogance collapses, dignity wins every time. But the story doesn't end here. It continues with you. If you believe in truth speaking louder than power, if you believe in dignity as a force that can't be broken, then this is your moment to stand with it. Subscribe now and join the movement where truth speaks louder than power. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that composure can outlast arrogance, that even the smallest voice can shift the balance when it carries the weight of justice. And finally, join the conversation below. What does dignity mean to you in today's world? Your answer might inspire someone else to hold firm the next time they're under pressure. This was more than a courtroom defense. It was a call to remember who we are when tested, and it begins with one truth: dignity, carried with courage, will always outshine intimidation.